All right, it is now officially 4 p.m. So thank you everyone for coming to the Authoring Content for Modern GIS session. I'm Shannon Kaliski. I'm one of the product managers for ArcGIS Enterprise. And with me today...
Hi, I'm Melanie Summers. I'm one of the product engineers on the ArcGIS Pro team.
And back there in the back, rocking the moral and emotional support for this presentation is Ty Fitzpatrick. His name is also on this slide.
So all of your hard questions at the end,
bombard. We're just going to give them to Ty. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to try to make this a super fun presentation for you. We know 4 o'clock can sometimes be that part of the day where you're like, I'm done. I've talked all I can talk. The coffee is no longer affecting me. I need something else. So, authoring content for Modern GIS. How many of you used ArcMap? Okay, good. That's about what we expected. How many of you are using Pro?
How many of you are publishing services and web GIS content from Pro?
Good.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Thank you for that. So Modern GIS, what on earth do we mean when we say Modern GIS? Is this yet another term you need to learn? Web GIS, Server GIS, Modern GIS? What's that? Maybe, is it something you need one of these for? Is this how you do Modern GIS? Or perhaps it's something that's anchored in sensors, this IoT we're all hearing about. Is that Modern GIS if we're doing this, we're achieving it? Maybe Modern GIS is something fantastical and amazing. In case you didn't see the UC plenary last year, Zootopia, the city of Zootopia there, was designed using CityEngine. Is that Modern GIS doing something like that? Or maybe a Modern GIS is something that tells a story and serves a cause. It has a deeper purpose and meaning. So here you see a story map with, definitely hits in the heartstrings there. Is that the epitome of Modern GIS? Is that what we're talking about? And the answer to any of those could be yes, it could be no. It really depends on your organization. Really, when we're talking about Modern GIS, what we mean is it's a GIS that's interactive, it's accessible. It's the kind of GIS that helps you explore questions, not just you, but anyone in your organization, where you can solve problems and find answers. And you can work with really any kind of data that you have, be able to bring that to the GIS and get started working with it. A Modern GIS is about more than just providing a REST endpoint or just a raw service. Not many everyday people can look at a REST endpoint and get something valuable out of it. It needs to be put into some sort of viewer or an application. But the power of Modern GIS is that power of the portal, the power of the system that works together, so that a regular person in your organization that doesn't even know what GIS stands for can log in somewhere and see something that they are actually going to be able to use. They can bring their own data to ask their own questions and solve their own problems. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about Modern GIS, what Melanie and I are talking about is GIS that you can share. And so for this session, we're going to be looking at the technology, the mechanics, the process of how do you achieve sharing in this new GIS, where we are striving for interactivity and accessibility. So from our survey at the beginning, you probably could guess what the technology is that's involved in here. It's ArcGIS Enterprise, it's ArcGIS Pro, and also possibly ArcGIS Online, depending on if you're choosing to manage in your own infrastructure or manage or run the software as SaaS. In that case, it's almost not even running software. In these next few scenarios, I'm going to be showing Online and Enterprise, but I believe for the majority of Melanie's presentation, she's going to focus on Enterprise. But just know that the workflow could apply equally. So whenever I start talking about sharing and publishing, especially with Enterprise, one of the biggest and first questions in people's minds is, what does that actually look like? What does that mean? So I'm going to go through a few common scenarios. This does not mean that these are every single scenario or situation that you could possibly come up with. As you look at it, you might think, well, what about this or that? Or maybe I could try it a little differently. You probably can. These are just some common patterns that we see people following. So one place that we see people start is where they want to use ArcGIS Enterprise as a system of record and ArcGIS Online as a system of engagement. And what I mean by that is you want to be able to have an enterprise geodatabase where all your data lives within your organization, but then you want to be able to provide that to ArcGIS Online as a service. Okay, so what does that look like? So here we have data living in an enterprise geodatabase, but where does the service get created? Well, you use that data within ArcGIS Pro and you create a service. And then you can share that service through web maps or layers to ArcGIS Online. So you have data to service. Now in this case, you're going to still copy some data, but at the end of the day, you're creating web apps for the public. What's another scenario? Oops, wrong way. Another scenario we see is where people want to support internal and external stakeholders. Part of the power of ArcGIS Enterprise as compared to its predecessor ArcGIS for Server is that the portal really is an integrated part. So you have your data, you share it to ArcGIS, you pull it into ArcGIS Pro to create that service that you're going to share. Then you publish the service to ArcGIS Enterprise. Those web maps and layers can be used by your internal users that you can then either offer the service and pull the service into ArcGIS Online, or use distributed collaboration, which is a new capability of ArcGIS that was introduced at ArcGIS 10.5 and can be used between Enterprise and ArcGIS Online beginning at 10.5.1. To then be able to create something such as a web app that can be consumed by members of the public. So let's break that down because there has been a lot of questions about ArcGIS Pro publishing to a server and what's actually happening here. Well, whenever you are sharing from Pro to Enterprise, you are sharing to a portal. But ultimately behind the scenes, you're still creating a service. And that service, you can still access the REST endpoints. And that's not just restricted to your hosting server. That can be any federated server as part of your ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. And then, of course, that service you can then access from ArcGIS Online, or you can copy or reference the data to online through distributed collaboration. So there we see those internal stakeholders are being represented. But it's not just things going from Pro to a web GIS like Enterprise or Online. Sometimes you want to pull data or content from your web GIS into Pro. You can absolutely do that. You also can push from Pro to both Enterprise and Online by simply changing what you have set as your active portal. And of course, you probably can think of some more scenarios that we might be using to have ArcGIS Enterprise, ArcGIS Pro, and ArcGIS Online working together. And although in all of those scenarios I showed Enterprise and Online, you could easily just use one or the other. You don't have to use both. But it is a misconception that we see all the time that people think that you can't use both, that you must choose one or the other. So that's why with those scenarios I did show Enterprise and Online and Pro. Okay, so Enterprise, ArcGIS Pro plus Enterprise and or Online is what equals a modern GIS from that technology perspective. And the Enterprise and Online part is what we consider the web GIS. So as you're seeing books or courses or anything that says web GIS and you're thinking, well, what is that? Is it Enterprise? Is it Online? The answer is it could be either. So you'll have to look both. In general, when we say web GIS, we mean that it applies equally to Enterprise or Online. So if you want to learn more about web GIS, there is another session happening on Friday where I am presenting with Kelly Giroux, one of the product managers from ArcGIS Online. And that will be Friday from 1 to 2 in the Pasadena, Sierra, and Ventura rooms. Or, of course, you can look for it on YouTube or E380 after the conference. It will be there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie to show some sharing from ArcGIS Pro.
Okay, so I'm going to be covering sharing from ArcGIS Pro today, and I'm going to start off right away with a demo of what that actually looks like. So a lot of you actually said that you work with ArcGIS Pro. Oh, that's a good point. And now you're actually looking at my screen. So impressed, a lot of you are already working with ArcGIS Pro. So here I am currently connected to my enterprise deployment, so ArcGIS Enterprise, and I'm gonna go ahead and share my layer out as a web layer. So I'm gonna right-click my layer, say Share as Web Layer. This is gonna open up the Share as Web Layer pane. And so from here, it's gonna pull in any metadata that I have with that layer already. I'm gonna go ahead and choose to copy all of my data. So when you used to publish from ArcMap, I'm sure you guys remember, it was very service-centric. So you chose the service that you were going to share to a specific server, you chose those configurations, and you went from there. So because we are integrated with the full web GIS model, we started kind of switching our thinking to web layers, because that's what our end users are actually going to be interacting with. They're not going to be interacting with that service endpoint. They're going to be working with web layers and web maps. And so instead of thinking about specific services, we thought about how those services were actually going to be used. And so the first thing that we wanted to think about was, what do we want our data to be doing? Do we want it to reference our registered data, or do we want that data to be copied up to the server? And we'll get into what those two options really mean later. For now, I'm going to choose the copy all data option. The next question that I have is, how am I actually going to be using that data? And the layer type that I choose is going to depend on how I actually use my data. So for this option, I'm going to be editing, so I'm going to choose a feature layer. Now, once I do that, under the configuration tab, you'll see my layer option, where you're going to get a lot of those operations and properties that you're used to seeing with the actual service. We're just doing it at the layer level. So I'm going to turn on editing here. Under the content tab, I see a preview of what's going to end up in my content in my portal. So I'm getting one new web feature layer with one sublayer. I'm going to analyze. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this out. So one new thing with sharing from Pro compared to ArcMap is that we did push the sharing process to an external process. So I can continue interacting with my map as this works. I could close Pro if I needed to. There's a lot more that you can continue working on. You can queue up multiple jobs, and you can view those from the jobs pane here to see what's actually going on. So this is overall what our general sharing process looks like. So we'll come back to that web layer in just a moment. But to review, when we're sharing from ArcGIS Pro, there's 4 main steps that we're going to do. The first thing is we're going to sign into our portal. That can be ArcGIS Online, that can be ArcGIS Enterprise. You can be connected to multiple portals at once, doesn't matter. But whichever portal is your active portal is the one that you're actually going to be sharing content to. You can choose to share from either the ribbon to share your entire map, or you can share a selection of layers out as their own web layer. I don't know if you guys remember, but in ArcMap, if you had one layer in your map that you wanted to share, you had to remove all of the other layers from your map and then share the map. To get around that, you just right-click and share the selection of layers instead. The next step is going to be analyze your data for any potential issues, and then you click Share or Publish. So no matter what content you're sharing from ArcGIS Pro, these are the 4 main steps you're always going to follow, whether that's a web layer, 2D content, or 3D content. So as we've mentioned, your web GIS can be ArcGIS Online, it can be ArcGIS Enterprise, it can be a combination. And when you're sharing to ArcGIS Online, by and large, it's a pretty simple process. Get all that data, copy it up into a SD file, throw it up there, the server handles everything. When we're talking about ArcGIS Enterprise, there's more stuff that you need to be aware of because you're managing that infrastructure that's actually supporting the process. So when we say ArcGIS Enterprise, just to make sure we're all on the same page, what are we actually talking about? It's that combination of portal for ArcGIS, ArcGIS server, and ArcGIS data store, plus web adapters, but
we're just
that's more you than me. So the parts that I care about. These are my three main parts. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm really going to be focusing on the sharing process as we share to ArcGIS Enterprise as opposed to ArcGIS Online, because most of that process you don't have to be super concerned about. So that base deployment. Is Portal for ArcGIS, ArcGIS Server, and ArcGIS Data Store. ArcGIS Data Store, with that ArcGIS Server, when you register it as your hosting server, gives you hosted services. Does that mean that you can only share hosted services to your hosting server? No, you can totally share your traditional map services to your hosting server as well. That being said, if you have federated an additional server with your portal, you can totally select that server to publish to from ArcGIS Pro. So you are not limited to only sharing hosted services, and you are not limited to only sharing to your hosting server. When you share from Pro, you get to choose which federated server you're actually publishing that service to. Now there's a lot of different pieces. We keep saying services, we keep saying web layers, web maps. How do those actually interact with each other? At the base level, what you guys are most used to working with are going to be web services. It's that URL that exposes your data for web clients to access. That service exposes data that's either referenced from a shared location that's registered with your server, or it can be copied up to the server. Web layers take that service and make it a nice, pretty interface, holds additional configurations such as attribute pop-ups, symbology, labeling information. And the nice thing about web layers is you can have multiple web layers that expose the same service. So without having to republish your data, you can use that same resource, reconfigure it, have multiple web layers exposing that service in different configurations to be used in different manners. And then what most of your end users are probably interacting with are actually web maps or web scenes that are then probably shared out in web applications. So those web maps or web scenes are just collections of web layers and mapping functionality. When you share from ArcGIS Pro, where do each of these pieces go? Did that rhyme? I think it rhymed.
It did.
That was nice. So your service is still being published to ArcGIS Server. That web layer and web map are being stored with Portal for ArcGIS. So when you share from Pro, both of those pieces are happening. And again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, because a lot of this is new terminology for us if you're used to publishing services. So web layers and web services, we know our layers are exposing our services. Which ones do which? So map image layer, do we all know? Map service, that can be dynamic or cache. So that is the map service that you know and love publishing from ArcMap.
And the note on map image layers is they cannot be shared to online.
No, they cannot.
So this is an enterprise only service and layer type right there is your map image layer. So if your plan was I'm going to make a bunch of map image layers and you're trying to share to online and you're not seeing that option light up, that's why. It is enterprise only on that one.
That is correct. Feature layers are going to expose your feature service. That might be a hosted feature service, or it might be the feature service that's connected to a map image layer. Your tile layer is going to be a cached map service that is specifically hosted. Vector tile layers are your vector tile services. Scene layers are going to be a cached scene service. And then web tools are going to be a geoprocessing service. And again, web tools are also going to be enterprise specific. Okay, so let's go back to Pro and take a look again at that, at sharing web layers. So here, that layer successfully shared. And before we share another layer, let's look at one of the benefits of working with web layers. I mentioned that you can have multiple layers with the same, or multiple layers that point to the same service. Let's look at what that actually is like as an experience. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this web layer in the map viewer. I'm going to copy this layer so that I have two of them. And then I'm going to go ahead and change the symbology on this layer to show plant condition. Give it a sec. Okay. Those are some really happy colors for some Not necessarily happy states, but that's okay. We'll leave it as is. So got some happy colors. I'm going to rename this layer real quick so that we know that we're looking at the condition of my plants. And I'm going to save this layer as a new web layer in my content.
So something interesting to you, if you're looking at this and you're like, wow, that's really valuable, you can continue to do this. And in the WebGIS side, in both Online and Enterprise, we've also introduced this concept of a hosted feature layer view. So these web layers that you can create and share from Pro, in addition to being able to create multiple layers from that same service, you also will be able to create hosted feature layer views. We're not demoing this here, but it's the same concept, being able to change symbology or query. If you're familiar with creating database views, it's a similar concept, except it's actual on your actual map layer. Right now, there's a few differences between if you're exercising that in Online versus Enterprise. So for example, in Online today, you can do a spatial query for your view. That will be coming in Enterprise. But you have the flexibility in this kind of modern GIS to do many things to where you aren't having to go back and recreate an entire service. You aren't having to go back to the database to construct a view, which can be a big deal if your databases are managed by an IT department and you're the GIS department and you can't do it. This puts the power in your hands. So, sorry, Melanie, let's continue with that.
Not a problem. Okay, so as you can see here, I have two different web layers, plant center and then plant center condition. If we scroll all the way down, let me open up Notepad real quick. Oh, you can see I was testing this before. Okay, so if I copy this URL and then I copy this URL, you'll see, I promise, that we're looking at the same hosted service, Plant Center. Two different web layers, different symbology, same service, so we're not duplicating resources on our server, we're not re-going through publishing, we're not overwriting. Really easy way to utilize web layers to make your life easier.
Now, if you're currently using these today, and whenever I just said the hosted feature layer views, you're like, ooh, that sounds interesting. Keep in mind, if you're doing distributed collaboration workflows, currently you cannot collaborate a hosted feature layer view. However, the layers that Melanie just showed you, you could absolutely collaborate as a reference, or if you wanted to copy them over, if they were a sync-enabled layer, you could do that as well. So that's one minor difference between the two, that you kind of have the same on the publishing side, like you're saving yourself the effort of going and republishing, but depending on what sort of workflows you foresee down the road, it might make you choose one versus the other.
For sure. Okay, so I have another map here. These are events happening in the city of Naperville, and I want to share this out as a map image layer. So I'm going to share the entire map this time because I want all of the layers in my map to share. I'm going to launch the Share as Web Layer pane once again. And this time I'm going to choose to reference registered data. As you can see in my contents pane here, my data is being pulled from my Oracle database. All of the layers are referenced there. And I'm just going to do a map image layer because I don't need to edit this, but if I wanted to turn on editing, I would be able to edit my data through my web layer as well. Under configuration, you can see here that just like when you are publishing a map service from ArcMap, you can choose to draw this dynamically from your data or using tiles from a cache. I'm going to choose dynamically. And again, from my content tab, you'll see that in my content, I am gaining a map image layer with these sublayers. Now you notice this drop down at the bottom here, federated servers. At this point, if I had an additional federated server in my portal, I could click this drop down and select that.
So Melanie, what would happen if they had a server role that didn't allow you to publish services to? So maybe it's a image server or a geoanalytics server and they want to publish something, just a layer right to that.
So if you select a federated server that does not have the correct server role or license on it, you'll get an analyzer error. If, for example, that were a federated server that had restricted publishing and you did not have access to it, you wouldn't see the server listed at all. So real quick, I'm gonna change this name real quick. I'm going to go ahead and analyze. And if I'm not mistaken, my database should already be registered there. So then I will click publish. So here what I'm getting is that map image layer that is exposing a dynamic map service that will reference my registered data. So all of this data that's in my Oracle database is going to, the service is going to draw directly from that database. So I already published this, expecting that it might take just a little bit of time, and we are a little bit short on time. So in my content here, I'm going to open up, or did it already finish? No, close. Okay, so I'm going to open up this map image layer that is the same map that I published previously. I'm going to open this up in the map viewer. And then back in Pro, give it a second to load. If you guys were ever curious about machine requirements for Enterprise, I don't actually suggest installing it on a laptop. It's not the fastest, but it works great for mobility and conferences. Okay.
I have it all on this machine.
I do. I have Oracle and Enterprise installed on this laptop. Okay, so this event here is the Fall Girls Weekend. So I'm going to go ahead and add in some items. The first thing that I personally would want at a Fall Girls Weekend is some concession stands, because I would like some food almost always. So I'll go ahead and add those. And next thing I'm going to want is probably a restroom. So we'll throw those in. A lot of them. A lot of food, a lot of restrooms. We are good to go. So I just added those directly to my database, and if I go back to that map viewer, you'll see that those updates are viewable in that map image layer directly. So that registered data is being referenced by my service that was published from Pro directly. Okay, so I've mentioned referencing registered data. It's what you guys are familiar with, but let's just dig into that a little bit more, because this is now from Pro an explicit option that you're choosing. So when you reference registered data, this is exactly what you're used to when you would publish from ArcMap. Any data in your map that's registered with your server is going to be referenced by the service. Any data in your map that is not registered with the server is going to be copied up as a file geodatabase. The copy all data option is new in Pro, and what that means is that all of the data in your map, whether it's registered with the server or not, is going to be copied up as a file geodatabase.
I think that's a really important distinction, because a lot of people overlook that and think that, oh, well, if it's referenced, and then it'll just automatically go. But
not if you choose copy all data. And part of that is obviously our hosted services. Everything is always going to be copied up. But if you chose copy all data and you were sharing out a map service, that means that you have a static copy of your data. So if you ever wanted to have a service that didn't continually get the updates from your enterprise data, and you don't want to unregister your data, publish, and then re-register, you don't have to do that anymore. You can choose the copy all data option. So working with registered data specifically, this is designed to support enterprise editing workflows, automatically referenced by your service. Your source data is going to be referenced, not copied. So this is my desktop machine. I'm pointing to whether that's folders or enterprise databases. When I share my content, the service that's published is going to point back and display that data, the same data that was in my desktop that I was looking at when I published. When I work with unregistered data, the data that I'm viewing as the publisher, when I share, is going to be copied onto the server, and that service is going to display the data that's actually been copied. So when you choose that copy all data option in ArcGIS Pro, all of your source data is going to be treated as though it's unregistered. What do we mean when we say it's registered? We are talking about data stores. So there are two main types of data stores, at least in my mind. There are data store items. These are locations that are registered with the server that contains data used by services, whether that's a folder or a geodatabase. Or I should say database, not geodatabase. Yeah. In that case, you're going to want to make sure that the operating system account that ArcGIS server is running as has at minimum read access to the data. If you want to use it for editing, it's going to need write access as well.
And that data can be on premises, on some machine you actually have. It can be in the cloud. You can set up cloud stores from Hadoop or Hive. It can be lots of different places. So definitely look into what we've added and what's changing, because that's things that we continue to update all the time.
Definitely. Now on the other side of that, and you'll remember this when we were talking about the base deployment, is ArcGIS Data Store. So it's part of the base deployment. It's a database that's managed by the server, and it's used to store data that's copied to the server for hosted services and data that is the result of analysis run within the enterprise portal. So when I was talking about your registered and unregistered data, we were talking about those data store items, not the ArcGIS data store.
It's also a big misconception. People think they have to put all of their data in ArcGIS Data Store to use ArcGIS Enterprise. You absolutely don't. Register these data stores. You can have all your enterprise view databases, all of these things, and it really can help optimize the way you use your system. You don't need to put them all in there. And also, if you've heard, ArcGIS Data Store is Postgres. That does not mean that you need to be a Postgres expert to be able to use this.
Not at all.
That bullet that Melanie has, that the database is managed by the server, is absolutely true. You don't have to do any of those things. The database takes care of it for you, or the server takes care of it for you.
Definitely. So how do you actually create those data store items? You're going to do that either before actually sharing out your content through the Manage Registered Data Stores pane that's new at ArcGIS Pro 2.1, or through ArcGIS Server. You can also do this while sharing by resolving analyzers. Whether that's a warning or an error will depend on the layer types you've selected and how your data is being handled. So real quick, because it's new and I'm pretty excited about it, let's take a look at the Manage Registered Data Stores pane in ArcGIS Pro. So from the Share ribbon, I'm going to choose the Data Stores option within the Manage section to launch the Manage Data Stores pane. And you'll see here that this is going to depend on which portal I have as my active portal. Right now, it's my ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. So I'll see any federated servers listed in the federated servers dropdown, just like when I was sharing. Here you can see that I can, very similar to the experience in ArcGIS Server Manager, I can validate, I can edit, I can delete, and I can also, let's actually, delete this guy and re-add him. So from here, I'm going to click the Add button, Add Folder.
And while Melanie's doing that, you'll notice that in her pane there, she has several data stores there. One being the ArcGIS Data Store, and then the rest being different enterprise databases or just other types of data stores. This is something that is a misconception that I hear on the enterprise side all the time. People think that if they have the ArcGIS Data Store set up as the registered managed database, that that's all they can have. Not true. You can register all of your data stores to all of your servers if you want. The main key with ArcGIS Enterprise is that for your hosting server, you must have ArcGIS Data Store as that managed database. But as Melanie said earlier, it doesn't mean that you can't have other data stores there. And those other data stores is what allows you to use your hosting server for both hosted layers and those federated layers as well. Or service-based layers, I should say. They're all federated.
It's true. Okay. So so we've really gone over the different ways your data can be handled, the different types of layers that you can share from ArcGIS Pro. Let's talk about sharing web maps, because that's something that's completely new with sharing from ArcGIS Pro, and it can do a lot more than you may realize is available to you. So when you're sharing web maps in ArcGIS Pro, we give you some preset configurations that make it really easy to very quickly share out all of your data in the best possible layer type and data combination that makes sense for you. When you share web maps, map level settings such as bookmarks are automatically going to be maintained. And then if you do need more control over those new web layers, you can either share them beforehand or you can split them and configure them individually within the Share as Web Map experience. If you shared them beforehand, you're totally good to go because existing web layers that are in your map are just going to be referenced by that web map. So if you brought in a number of existing web layers into your map in Pro, changed up some symbology, changed some visibility range, when you share that web map, it's going to save that configuration to the web map JSON. It's not going to go in and modify that existing web layer. It's not going to change any other maps where that web layer is being used. And then if the map has local layers, so layers that are not services, those are going to be published as new web layers. So let's take a look at what that experience actually looks like. So here I have remove a couple layers we don't need, and then let's zoom out and see what this map is actually for. So this is of the Houston area. All of those yellow dots are power outages, and then we have here a hotspot analysis done of where power outages were new, where they're kind of expected, and where we're seeing fewer power outages than we usually do. Now, if we look at the source of these layers, we're going to see that that hotspot and my addresses layer are both in my Oracle database again. And then you'll see that the yellow dots here, are coming from a service. So I'm going to go ahead and share this as a web map. And if we scroll down here, you're going to see that I can select a configuration. So just as when I was sharing a web layer from Pro, I had those two main data options, reference register data and copy all data. Same thing here. How do I want my data to be handled when it gets shared out onto my federated server? Within each of those sections, I have three main configurations: exploratory, editable, and visualization. And that's how you're planning on using this web map. Is it just going to be exploratory where you need feature access but you don't want people to be editing the data? Do you want them to be editing? Do you want this to just be for visualization? You don't necessarily need that feature access, but you want it to draw really quickly. So those are the three main use cases that we came up with, and then you choose how that data is going to be handled. I'll go ahead and choose reference register data exploratory. And then under configuration here, you'll see again that I'm getting a new web map, a map image layer that has two sublayers, addresses and space-time outages in Houston. So I'm going to click this layer and split this out, and you're going to see here that that just created two new map image layers. So within the web map experience, I'm able to share those separately. If I select this layer, I can click properties, and this is going to open up the properties of that map image layer. Under configuration, I can go in and change max record count, date fields, and some of the web layer properties. Because of the configuration I chose, it's always going to draw dynamically. If I had chosen visualization, it would always draw from tiles. So I will go ahead back here, and I will share this guy out. So this is the overall experience of sharing web maps. We'll come back to this web map in just a little bit in our next demo. But let's talk about those configurations while that shares out. So as I mentioned, we have those three main use cases: exploratory, editing, and visualization. Within each of those, depending on the data option that you chose, is going to determine what type of web layer we're going to try to share. So if you chose exploratory reference register data, as you saw, I got map image layers. If I had chosen the exploratory configuration but the copy all data option, that would have given me non-editable hosted feature layers. So depending on the configuration and the data option you choose, that's going to determine the default layer type that we're going to try to share. Now, if you happen to have data in your map that is not supported by that primary web layer type, we're gonna fall back to the next best option. So if the default layer type was feature layers, but you have raster in your data, the raster layers are gonna get shared out as tile layers instead. So nothing's gonna be lost, it just will be just a little bit different. Very quickly, I do want to touch on sharing 3D data because 3D is no longer siloed from 2D data in ArcGIS Pro. It's side by side. It's really easy to convert your 2D data to 3D, view it, and share it. Those same 4 steps that we went over at the beginning are completely applicable when we're sharing our 3D data, and more we're making steps to make this process easier for you and more accessible.
One note on the sharing of 3D data. Your ArcGIS data store should be, especially if it's hosted, needs to be configured as a tile cache data store. You can have a tile cache data store and a relational data store on the same data store instance there. You do that through the configuration wizard. I know best practices says you should separate those out, and of course, if you are heavy in 3D and relational, absolutely do. But we find for a lot of users that are not heavy in 3D and are really in more of that relational data workspace, that they have no issues when they combine relational and tile cache data stores together. But that tile cache data store is what supports 3D within ArcGIS Enterprise. So make sure that you do have that configured.
Thank you. Okay, so that was just a quick touch on 3D. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to demo that, but if you are curious about sharing 3D data, please come on over to the ArcGIS Pro section of the, what do we call that? The Expo? The Expo. The ArcGIS Pro section of the Expo, and I'd be more than happy to show you guys sharing 3D data then. So we mentioned a few slides ago, sharing web tools. So web tools are the portal item that exposes a geoprocessing service. How many of you guys work with GP services? Good number, yeah? It's fun stuff, it's good. Okay, so when you share GP services from Pro, just like from ArcMap, you're getting all of that analytical power that you've put a lot of effort into, and you get to put that out and make it accessible to all of the users in your platform. And the web tools that you share from ArcGIS Pro are going to be available through web clients, including web app builder for ArcGIS. You can consume it back into Pro. You can create a custom application that draws it in. Lots of options there.
And one really exciting option, if you have been watching the plenary and you've been watching what's been happening at Dev Summit, you've been interested in the ArcGIS API for Python, if you publish a GP service as a web tool, then the ArcGIS API for Python can call that web tool. So that means that if you're doing things with third-party Python libraries and you're like, wow, I want to now do a geoprocessing service that I've created here, how can I do this within the ArcGIS API for Python? Well, you can do it by creating a web tool and calling that web tool. So that is one of the newer ways that web tools can be used as well. So it's pretty cool.
The process of actually sharing web tools from Pro is very similar to what you're used to from ArcMap. You successfully run a GP tool, whether that's a model, a Python script, or one of the built-in tools. And then from that history item, you share it out. So let's take a look at that process. So I'm going to go back into Pro here. And so we saw I have this map with hotspot analysis of power outages in the Houston area. So I have a little model here that basically takes an area of interest, grabs all of the addresses within that area of interest, and will create a mailer for them that basically explains, hey, you experienced a power outage recently, here are some of the reasons why you might have experienced a power outage, and here are the ways that you can mitigate the chances of this happening again. Probably you'd be doing this for an area that's experienced a new increase in hotspot, a new hotspot of power outages. So I have already run this GP tool here. And so from my catalog pane in Pro, I have a successfully run model here. So I'm going to right click this. I'm going to say share as web tool. This is going to open up my share as web tool pane. And again, all of that metadata is going to pull in automatically. My data options are the same. I can reference my registered data or I can copy it. Under configuration, you have some of those options available to you that you always have when you share out geoprocessing services. And then under the content tab is where I'm going to actually configure the individual parameters of my web tool. So I have my power outage outreach mailer. I'm going to click this little pencil here to configure that. Under areas of interest, I want this to be a user-defined option. You know what? Did I select the wrong one? So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to set this to be a choice list so that users can specify which area of interest they want. Addresses, I'm going to make this a constant value so that they can't change which addresses are the input. Go ahead and analyze that. And I'll share that out as soon as I change this name. And there it will continue going. So I, as you noticed probably from having already published this and running into the name problem, I have already done that. So let's take a look at one that's already been shared out. So going back to my content, if I scroll down here, you're going to see that I have my power outage outreach mailer. I'm going to open up this web tool. I'm going to scroll all the way down and I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to go back to my content, and that web map that we shared earlier, I'm going to turn into a web application using Web App Builder. So go to the item details page of my web map. And then I'm going to say create web app using the Web App Builder. This is going to open up the configuration of that web application. And I'm going to add in a new widget that's going to be a geoprocessing widget. Scroll all the way down, choose widget 1, and then my geoprocessing box. I'm going to put in that URL I just copied. I'm going to validate it. And then for that area of interest input, I'm going to choose that I want them to interactively draw that on a map. I'll say OK. And then let's save this and launch it. Okay, so now I have a web application that's consuming that web map that I just shared. We have our geoprocessing widget. I'm going to zoom into this hotspot that I see. Ooh, I'm going to zoom way too far, right next to it. Okay, so I'm going to draw my area of interest. I'm going to execute. So here we're running that web tool that I just shared from that successfully run history item on my server, so that for just this area, I'm going to get my PDF mailers. Fingers crossed. Woot woot. There it is. Okay, so here we have the addresses in the area. I'm going to open up, or I'm going to download my zipped file of PDF mailers. And we'll see here that for each address, we have an explanation about power outages and what that might mean for them.
Another cool thing about web tools is that if you're using the map viewer in the portal, you can actually navigate to the web tool so that one of your users in your organization could actually run that tool against data in your map viewer. So that's, I think, super cool.
Yeah. Makes it the geoprocessing work that you do in Pro super accessible all across your organization, which is fantastic. Okay, so we've covered web layers, we have covered web maps, we have covered web tools, and now I think we're done.
We are. Please remember to take the survey. Let us know how you liked the presentation, what you loved, what you didn't love as much, anything. We love getting feedback, so please do take the time to do that. And we have about 10 minutes here to answer questions. So any questions you have, we are happy to hear them.
And by that, we mean Ty is happy to hear them.
pie back there with the red. Yes.
Yeah.
So regarding copy data server, is there an option to overwrite? If you have a service that you want to just, like you said, to use a service that's static while you're changing the base data, just you want to override it periodically. You don't create new one.
Yeah, so overriding services is supported in Pro. You can overwrite hosted feature services as well as dynamic map services, whether that's data copied or referenced by the service. Yeah?
How was instead of going to Enterprise to get AGO, how was the web app, does it honor layer grouping yet?
Layer grouping is not yet honored by web maps. So if you really want your groups to be maintained, and you said you're going to ArcGIS Online? Yeah, so to ArcGIS Online, that currently does not support group layers. You would have to share it out as a tile layer if you wanted to see those group layers in your contents. And there's kind of some backway workflows to connect your tile layer to a feature layer so you still get feature access. But that's definitely feedback that we've gotten many times. We know that people need group layers in their maps. We totally recognize it, and we're working on it.
I like how the head nod went from like yes to like
yes.
Anyone else?
Yeah. So you're talking about basically the management of your map services through portal, because if you delete the portal item, the map service isn't deleted. Is that what you're talking about? So right now, that is not quite there. We have recently, with the next release of Enterprise, when you delete your map service portal item, it will delete the service on the server as well. Yeah. But currently, you have to go into ArcGIS Server Manager and delete the service manually.
Right. And for hosted services, obviously, you don't have to do that. You delete it in the portal, it deletes in the server. But like Melanie said, this next release is when we expect to have that for consistent.
Yes.
Okay.
Version management of server.
So version management of data or version?
So you want to have versions of your service?
Yeah. That's definitely not something that we have on the list for the next release, but that's some interesting feedback. So yeah, I'll take that back to the development team. I haven't, that isn't one that's been on the list yet, but that doesn't mean that
if you want to give like your specific use case and all of that info, we would be happy to collect that.
Yeah. Okay. And then you had a question?
I would love to talk to you and look at that directly afterwards. Yeah. But I don't have a blanket statement for why it's failing. But let's talk. There are, if you go to your local app data in the Esri directory, it's in the, I'll show you. So under Esri, ArcGIS Pro, staging, under sharing processes, if you go in the jobs pane, you can see the specific job ID, so 12 there. And then that'll give you a sharing job log, which will give you detailed information on exactly what's happening. And that sometimes will give you more information. It depends on if it's sharing, if it's failing. On the pro side of things, you'll get more information here. If it's failing on the server side of things, you'll generally want to go into Server Manager to see that info.
All right, well, with that, Thank you. Any last minute questions? Melanie and I will be up here for about another 6 minutes. And thank you for being at Dev Summit.